Let's break down 12 must-add players off of the waiver wire as we begin to move into Week 9 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 9 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and all of their Week 8 NFL Pick'ems for Monday Night Football are also already live. Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Monday Night Football or towards Week 9's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that is a free NFL Pick'em for Week 9 or Monday Night Football, as well as up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up with promo code TheCatch on Underdog. So it is a pretty gross week at the running back position in terms of potential ads off of the waiver wire outside of mainly some handcuff options, but let's just stick with our tried and true waiver wire player that we seem to talk about every single week, and that is Alexander Mattison, sitting at 70% rostered. So this is probably going to be just about the last time we can really mention Alexander Mattison. I don't know. He's got a Week 10 bye, so maybe he'll get dropped in some leagues going into Week 10. But not a great matchup in Week 8. We expected a bit of a down game for Mattison, who's had double-digit fantasy points 3 games in a row, but 9.4 fantasy points against the Chiefs at home. Had a total of 14 touches for just 15 rushing yards. That Chiefs defense just continues to be the best run defense in the NFL, giving up the fewest fantasy points to the running back position, 1.07 yards per carry, but he did add 5 catches for 29 receiving yards. So, I mean, that definitely helped, right? And at least if you were forced to start Mattison out of desperation, he at least gave you some sort of RB1 volume, I guess we could say, but definitely a low ceiling this past week. But moving along to Week 9, he gets the Cincinnati Bengals, so a much better matchup. This Raiders team kind of in a weird spot right now. We got Gardner Minshew as the starting quarterback in Week 8. We also saw some flashes of Desmond Ridder very briefly, and Minshew was okay, but not great. Threw 2 touchdowns, 209 passing yards, and fumbled at the end of the game. Ended up essentially being one of the main reasons the Raiders did not have a chance to win the game. So I don't know what the Raiders are going to look like in Week 9, but it's a better matchup for Alexander Mattison specifically against the Bengals. And this is still a player who's given you double-digit fantasy performances in every game on the season except for 3. Zamir White is back in the mix, and it just has not mattered. He had just 2 touches this past week against the Chiefs for -1 rushing yards. If Mattison is out there and available in your league, I do think he's worth picking up moving forward as he has been for the past couple of weeks. But the last thing I'll say is that Alexander Mattison has a very strong playoff schedule. Gets the Falcons in Week 15, the Jags in Week 16, and the Saints in Week 17. All very soft run defenses, especially the Jaguars and the Saints. So if he's out there floating around, he is worth rostering as we move into Week 9. Let's move along to the wide receiver position, and let's start with Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills, who was in last week's video and has now moved up to 64% rostered. So he's still kind of in that area. Like, depending on your league size, he might be available, but for a lot of you guys, he may not be available. But 18 fantasy points in Week 8 against the Seahawks, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 70 receiving yards, and a touchdown after having 17.5 fantasy points in Week 7 against Tennessee. He now has double-digit fantasy performances in 3 out of his last 4 matchups. It is a tough matchup on paper against Miami in Week 9, as Miami for majority of the season has had the best pass defense in the NFL, but didn't quite look that way against the Cardinals, so who knows exactly what we're going to get this week out of Miami. But then the following week, the Bills will play the Colts. Then they have a tough matchup against the Chiefs in Week 11, but should at least be a competitive game script. And that's a nice thing right now with the Bills. Like, they're going to have some soft matchups that we want to try and exploit, but also it just kind of feels like the Bills are one of these teams that when they are playing, the game script's going to be good. So we might be able to still, start players in fantasy just due to the game script itself. But the addition of Amari Cooper to this offense has made things really interesting. We saw a big game out of Khalil Shakir with 20 fantasy points. He sits at 79% rostered. Do you think he's worth adding if he's floating around? And I mean, Amari Cooper had just one catch against Seattle. And I mean, the Bills were kind of blowing out Seattle for majority of the game. But yeah, it just feels like this offense is opening up. We saw Dalton Kincaid have a great game. We saw James Cook have a great game. And it looks like Josh Allen really trusts Keon Coleman, and he almost had a second touchdown grab in this game as well. So if he's out there floating around, get a good offensive matchup in Week 9 between the Dolphins and the Bills, Coleman is definitely worth rostering at this point in the season. Next up is Calvin Ridley. I can't believe I'm saying it, of the Tennessee Titans. I will admit there is really probably just about nobody who was as down on the Titans offense this past week as I was. And I mean, it's not like the offense was good by any means. And certainly the blowout that I was expecting by the Lions did take place. And it was interesting, though, because Mason Rudolph still did some things in this game. He had 21 fantasy points. He was 22 of 38, 266 passing yards, threw a touchdown, ran for 29 yards and a touchdown. You know, still had some turnovers, but point being is that Calvin Ridley, 15 targets, 10 receptions, 143 receiving yards, 23.6 fantasy points. This is the first game with no DeAndre Hopkins. We saw Tyler Boyd have 6 targets, 3 catches. We did see some work out of Nick Westbrook-Ikini as well with 4 targets, 2 receptions, 39 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And it's really interesting. He's had a touchdown in the past 3 games, but he's had 9 or less fantasy points in 2 out of those 3 games, 11.9 fantasy points this past week against the Lions. So maybe keep an eye on him as well, but I don't think the volume's good enough. But yeah, I mean, we saw the ball spread around a little bit here by Mason Rudolph, and obviously the main beneficiary of that was Calvin Ridley. So he could continue to be a player that we can play in the flex. I don't know if I'm ready to trust Calvin Ridley. I mean, he had 24.7 fantasy points in week 2, and then over the following 3 weeks, in weeks 3, 4, and 6, the Titans bye week was in week 5, 2.5 or less fantasy points. But the opportunity here is that there's no DeAndre Hopkins, and we do have a change at quarterback that's taken place over the past couple weeks with Mason Rudolph as the starting quarterback for the Titans. So that could certainly mean more potential work here for Calvin Ridley if this passing game is actually going to be better under Mason Rudolph. I guess the verdict's still out there as well. But it's a good matchup against the Patriots in Week 9. They get a good matchup against Minnesota in Week 7. They get Jacksonville in Week 14. A pretty strong playoff schedule for Calvin Ridley as well. The Bengals, the Colts, and the Jaguars. And then the Titans also play the Jaguars in Week 14. So Ridley, if he's out there floating around, I don't know if we're necessarily going to trust him on a weekly basis, but he's probably worth a flex play if you are able to scoop him up. Moving along, let's talk about Cedric Tillman, a player we talked a lot about going into this past week. He sits at 24% rostered. The Browns had a big offensive day. Tillman had a big day in terms of receiving, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 99 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 14.1 yards per catch, and 28.9 fantasy points after having 18.1 fantasy points in week 7. We did see Jerry Jeudy also have double-digit fantasy points with 12.9 fantasy points, and we saw another double-digit performance out of Elijah Moore with 16.5 fantasy points, not to mention tight end David Njoku, who a lot of us were expecting to have a good game and a good matchup against the Ravens, had 17.1 fantasy points. Jameis Winston came out and he did some Jameis things in this game, but ultimately he threw 3 touchdowns and 334 passing yards, was 27 of 41. So it's a much tougher matchup this week against the Chargers than it was in week 8 against the Ravens, who, I mean, this offense, our defense has just struggled against opposing wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks. The secondary is just not syncing together. But I still like this Browns offense moving into the week, and I think that Cedric Tillman, sitting at 24% rostered, has got to be a top priority add. I think he's a little bit more reliable potentially than Elijah Moore, who sits at 7% rostered. Jerry Jeudy sits at 62% rostered, but you know, I just don't feel as good about Jeudy. He's certainly worth adding at this point, but we also need to kind of tamper our expectations going into this Week 9 matchup. Like I said, much, much tougher. Going up against the Chargers, then going up against the Ravens, but there's obviously going to be opportunity here as well. So, I mean, Jameis Winston had basically a dropped interception right before he, threw the second touchdown to Cedric Tillman that, gave the Browns the lead at the end of that game, but I still going to keep the faith here. Jameis is out there slinging. There's going to be opportunity for these Browns wide receivers. I think the main target to go after on the waiver wire for me heading into Week 9 is Cedric Tillman. We have Demarcus Robinson of the LA Rams, who had 17.5 fantasy points in Week 8, sitting at just 15% rostered. Now, there's obviously going to be some volatility when we're looking at players like Demarcus Robinson, Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington whenever he returns, as well as Tyler Johnson, and basically the Rams wide receivers who are not named Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, now that those two are back in the mix. But I really still believe that going into this season, it was supposed to be Kupp, Puka, then Demarcus Robinson on this depth chart. We've just seen some fluctuation as soon as Kupp and Puka were down for the count for a couple of weeks. And still think that Demarcus Robinson can carve out a large role in this offense. So, I mean, just 2 catches in Week 8 against Minnesota in a good matchup. But those 2 catches were 2 touchdowns, and that's what led to that fantasy stat line, right? But it's a good matchup this week against the Seattle Seahawks. This defensive unit is struggling. Their offense is struggling. And the Rams are now in position with a completely different looking Matthew Stafford and those receivers healthy to try and make a run here at the midpoint in the season. And overall, I think Demarcus Robinson could be a big part of that potential run. So we want to keep a close eye here. Like when Jordan Whittington returns, does that change things? Next week, we see Tutu Atwell be the guy outside of, Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. Who knows? But at this point, it looks like the Rams are going to be throwing the football quite a bit. So if Robinson is out there, I think he's worth adding. Maybe not starting right away, but I do think he is worth a roster spot as we approach Week 9. Up is Xavier Leggett of the Carolina Panthers, who is another player who kind of falls into that category of like, I don't know if I trust Leggett just yet, but he sits at 36% rostered, and we just have all of these rumors surfacing about Deontay Johnson potentially getting traded to another team, right? Then we still have Adam Thielen hanging out on IR, dealing with that hamstring injury. He could return, which could impact things here, but ultimately, I think Leggett's the player to take a look at, especially with the potential for Deontay Johnson to be traded. Now, we look back from weeks 4 to this past week in Week 8. 19.6 fantasy points, 1.8 fantasy points, 11.3, 2.9, 13.4. Xavier Leggett has scored a touchdown every other game since Week 4 and has had double digits every other game. And then the games that he hasn't scored, he's at 2.9 or less fantasy points. So definitely still some volatility here, but if Xavier Leggett's going to be the wide receiver 1 for the Panthers, he should be rostered just for that reason. Now, I get it. It's the Panthers, and we might get Bryce Young. We might get Andy Dalton. Probably better if Andy Dalton returns at quarterback, but at the same time, look over the last 2 weeks, not like Bryce Young was that much worse than Andy Dalton was in Week 7. So I don't know. But the point being is that number 1 wide receivers, regardless of how bad the offense are, should at least be rostered, even if they're just sitting on your bench, and then our potential spot plays against weak defenses. So right now, it looks like Leggett's going to be that guy. I do want to also mention that Jalen Coker stepped up in this game as well. He had 6 targets, 4 receptions, 78 receiving yards, and scored a touchdown towards the end of the game for 17.8 fantasy points. He had 10.8 fantasy points in Week 5 against the Bears as well, so he's certainly worth keeping an eye on. But I think for the most part, I'm going to try and add Leggett if I want to try and build some depth at the wide receiver position. Last wide receiver I want to mention is Khalif Raymond of the Detroit Lions, who sits at just 3% rostered, and he has quietly had double-digit fantasy performances in 3 weeks straight, 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games, not including what he's done in terms of kick returns and punt returns as well. So the main thing here is that Jameson Williams is going to at least be out for another week, and we should get a good divisional matchup between the Packers and the Lions in Week 9. And both those secondaries, although they've played a little bit better over the past 2 weeks, have still bent for the most part on the season. We don't know if Jordan Love's going to be healthy or not in week 9, but ultimately this should provide a good game script and another game script where Khalif Raymond should be involved. And at the end of the day, right now at the Lions, it feels like everybody on this team can score on a weekly basis. So I will say I don't think Khalif Raymond is necessarily like a long-term play. We'll find out. The way the Lions have been playing, maybe he is. But for the most part, if you need a spot play, especially in a deeper league, I think that Khalif Raymond could be a decent flex, low ceiling flex. He's had 11 or more fantasy points in the last 3 games, though, as we approach week 9. Moving along to the tight end position, let's talk about Cade Otton of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who we talked a lot about going into week 7 against the Ravens. Then we still talked a lot about going into week 8 as well. 10 targets, 9 receptions, 81 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 29 fantasy points for Cade Otton in week 8 against the Falcons. Now, it's a much tougher matchup this week against the Kansas City Chiefs. This defensive unit is nothing to play around with. The Raiders did some stuff. I mean, Jacoby Myers had a good game, for example, I wasn't expecting, but they were also pretty stout against Brock Bowers, who's arguably the best young tight end in the league right now, I think we could easily say. So this should be a tougher matchup overall for Cade Otton, but we really look at the breakdown here in terms of Buccaneers pass catchers, and I talked about this going into the week. I said Cade Otton, Rachaad White are probably your 2 primary pass catchers. Like we said, Cade Otton, had 9 receptions. Rachaad White had 6 targets, 5 receptions. Worth noting that Bucky Irving had 7 targets, 7 receptions. So he outbid Rachaad White in my prediction there. Then when we look at the wide receivers, Jalen McMillan, 7 targets, 4 receptions. Sterling Shepard, 5 targets, 3 receptions. And then Trey Palmer, just 2 targets and 2 receptions. So the running backs and the tight end position are going to be who sees the primary amount of targets on this team, while Mike Evans continues to be out, and we know that Chris Godwin is out for the rest of the season. So Cade Otton, point being, he might not see this type of ceiling again, but if he is out there and available in your league, which he is rostered in 71% of leagues, might be a little bit tougher to pick him up. But regardless, if he's out there, he needs to be added as we continue to move in to week 9. Another tight end we've talked a lot about over the past couple weeks who may actually be available in your league is Zach Ertz, sitting at 40% rostered. He now has double-digit fantasy performances in his past 3 games. Tough matchup this past week against the Bears, who haven't allowed a lot of fantasy points to the tight end position, and he still had 14.7 fantasy points, 11 targets, 7 receptions, and 77 receiving yards. Jaden Daniels able to play. I think that was a big help. But Marcus Mariota, even in week 7, still looked Zach Ertz's way quite a bit. And it looks like Jaden Daniels is going to be good to go as we approach week 9 against the Giants. So this is a big divisional matchup. The last time Ertz played the Giants this year in week 2, he had 10 fantasy points. And Ertz is a top 10 fantasy tight end at this point in time. And he just continues to be one of these players who maybe doesn't have the highest ceiling, but you can trust that you're probably going to get double digits out of him in a safe floor on a weekly basis. So Zach Ertz, I do think, should be rostered in more leagues and is completely worth starting at this point in the season. Once again, the ceiling might not be crazy high here, but this offense looks good. They really only have so many pass catchers on this team, so Zach Ertz should continue to be in a good spot as the season progresses. And I think he should be a priority add at the tight end position as we move in to week 9. All right, let's go over a couple quarterbacks, and let's kick it off with Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos. And if you guys watched last week's last minute waiver wire video, I told you this was one of my top streaming options at the quarterback position going into the week. He had 29.7 fantasy points, was 28 of 37, 284 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. Surprisingly, just 4 rushing yards, but a rushing touchdown as well. Bo Nix now has 19 or more fantasy points in every game since week 3, except for 2 matchups. He now has 21 or more fantasy points in 3 out of his last 4 games. And he might look at this matchup against the Ravens and say, I don't know if I feel so good about Bo Nix and the Broncos on the road here, but this Ravens defense is just not good. They are good against the run for the most part, but they're not good against opposing quarterbacks, opposing wide receivers, or opposing tight ends. And sure, maybe Bo Nix isn't going to have as high of a ceiling against the Ravens as he did against the Panthers, but he is certainly going to be startable this week if you need a streaming option, or if you're still rostering like combination like Patrick Mahomes and Anthony Richardson. I don't know, but he sits at just 31% rostered. I do think he is worth adding. It's another or tougher matchup, I should say, in week 10 against Kansas City. But like I said, in the last minute waiver video, Bo Nix is going to be a quarterback that we can spot play throughout the year against the Raiders in week 12, Cleveland in week 13, Cincinnati in the fantasy championship, the Colts in week 15. There's going to be times where we can roll with Bo Nix this season. And this past week certainly proved that. And I would not be afraid of the Ravens defense as we move into week 9. Bo Nix is a fantasy option even against the Ravens. That brings us to Matthew Stafford of the LA Rams, who sits at 33% rostered, and he's back to life. Puka's back. Kupp is back. This offense is getting right. Stafford looked like the normal Matthew Stafford that we expect, right? 4 passing touchdowns, 279 passing yards in week 8 on Thursday Night Football against the Vikings, and they get a great matchup this week against the Seattle Seahawks in week 9. So I think this one pretty much speaks for itself. Stafford had been dropped, rightfully so, in a lot of leagues. He's dropped down to 33% rostered, but no, I don't know if anyone was really expecting both Puka and Kupp to be back in week 8, but this offense looks completely different when those two are on the field. It was a soft matchup. The Vikings defense has been great. Their front seven's been great, all that stuff. They're good against the run, but they've been very soft against the pass, and that showed in week 8. This week, another good matchup here in week 9 against the Seattle Seahawks, who just got torched by the Buffalo Bills. So Stafford is out there and available, even in single quarterback formats. Really like Stafford moving forward. This is a team that's going to try and make a run for the playoffs. They've got some good upcoming matchups, some good upcoming game scripts as well. Thursday Night Football was enough. If Stafford's out there, he should be rostered in a higher percentage of leagues. Last but not least, we're going to take a look at Jameis Winston. I just wanted to throw somebody in here who was actually, in 10% or less of leagues in terms of roster percentage. And that's right where Jameis is at, 10% rostered. He might be out there for you guys who play in double quarterback leagues, super flex leagues, maybe even available in some of your dynasty leagues, but 23.5 fantasy points in week 8 against the Ravens, 27-41, 334 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, had the fumble that was lost in this game, but no interception. So like we mentioned earlier, it's a much tougher matchup against the Chargers in week 9, but we've got some playmakers stepping up here between Cedric Tillman and Judy, David Njoku, Nick Chubb is back, Elijah Moore has done some stuff. So also the Chargers defense, while it's still been good, it hasn't really been shut out necessarily, as we've seen in the past 2 weeks against the Saints and the Cardinals. Better against the Saints, but you would also almost expect more from that defense going up against Spencer Rattler for a majority of that game. So I don't know. This is a home game for the Browns. This will definitely be a testament of what we're going to be able to expect out of the Browns. But if you need a last-minute play out of the quarterback position, Jameis Winston could certainly be that in a single quarterback format. I don't know that he's particularly going to have over 23 fantasy points in week 9, but he certainly is looking like a streaming option as we move into the week. That'll do it for today's video. There are 12 players you guys can go to the waiver wire and add moving into week 9 of 2024 fantasy football. And just as a reminder, I have to record these while Sunday Night Football is being played. So if anything major happens in Sunday Night Football or Monday Night Football that leads to waiver wire priority ads, I will drop that in a linked or a pinned comment down below, And while you're down there, drop me a comment with any fantasy questions moving into week 9 of the season. I'll answer every single comment on this video. So if you guys need anything whatsoever as we move into week 9 of 2024 fantasy football, drop me a comment down below. I'll get back to you when I can. And don't forget, guys, as the week goes on, we're going to have every single thing you could possibly need here on the channel for week 9 of 2024 fantasy football. So most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, saw it here on the catch.